haven't said anything yet. I also hope you'll applaud afterwards. But thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak. That is an honor to be in this society. Thank you to Mr. Brown and Mr. Christoffersen for their very inspiring speeches about the Council, to which I shall, of course, also add further information. There's been a lot of very essential questions and comments that's been raised here during the first hours, and I'm also looking forward to a good debate afterwards. I want to thank the Free Press Society for its formidable, serious contribution to the political debate, and for the stern defense of freedom of speech that you always deliver. I think your presence in Denmark is more essential than you might think yourself, even if a lot of you are very big-headed. There was a thing mentioned by the chairwoman in the beginning that you had failed to get any political opponents to me. That surprises me, because I do think that we in Denmark have a very open debate about these matters, and it is not as if I don't participate in political discussions with my... well, as you know, victims and politicians and activists, diplomats, journalists and students around the world spend much time to shine a spotlight on urgent human rights situations that require global attention, especially through the United Nations Human Rights Council, as we are here to talk about today. Unfortunately, as has also been mentioned, the Council doesn't listen. No, and the reason it doesn't listen is that almost one in four of its members of this Council actually today abuse human rights themselves. It's not easy to condemn others of crimes that their own states commit daily, unless, of course, the alleged perpetrator is Israel, then anything goes. Of the Council's 47 members, 11 are regarded by Washington's Freedom House as not free when it comes to political rights and civil liberties, and where there is violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And 15 of the rest of the members have records that earned them the partly free rating. In other words, only 21 members out of the 47 are considered free. This is not how the Human Rights Council describes itself. On the front page of its website, we can read the following, quote, "The Council takes responsibility for strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights around the globe, and for addressing situations of human rights violations and make recommendations on them." And on their website it praised all 47 members, which surprised me, for their, quote, "contribution to the promotion and protection of human rights, as well as their voluntary pledges and commitments in this regard," unquote. We have to look at the United Nations General Assembly to find out what happened and how the Council has become a tragical laughingstock that is no longer taken seriously by the democratic free world. That is, of course, only when you sit face to face with ministers, ambassadors, or leading politicians, when you speak to them off the record. And I can assure you of this, there is an enormous agreement in practically the whole political spectrum, I think definitely in Denmark, but also abroad, that this is a laughingstock. But nobody says it in public. When they're on the spotlight, when they're on a podium, when they're in front of cameras or microphones, and they would immediately start singing the usual politically correct hymns, praising the Human Rights Council. The bravest of them might, though, find the courage to add, well, It's not all about the Council that's perfect, but what in the world is perfect. And we are working on it. But back to the General Assembly that elected these awful member states to the Human Rights Council. In the election, not one of the 11 not free countries received less than 74% of the votes out of the 193 member UN General Assembly, and some received more than 90%. Actually, some of the candidates with the worst human rights records have received some of the largest amount of votes. The 11, along with the votes each one received, are, and I shall mention them: Burundi, 162 votes; China, 180; Congo, 185; Cuba, 160; Egypt, 173; Ethiopia, 186; Iraq, 173; Qatar, 142, that's where we're going to have the World Cup in football next time; Rwanda, 176; Saudi Arabia, 152. They didn't do very well that day, did they? They only had 152. And then the United Arab Emirates, 159. As a curiosity, Saudi Arabia, famous for its many breaches of human rights, is also on the executive board of UN Women, the Agency for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women. Venezuela, which has imprisoned democratic opposition leaders and caused mass hunger, and is also on the executive board of the UN Development Program. Communist China was just re-elected to the UN Human Rights Council and also sits now on the UNESCO Executive Board. That is, of course, as you know, has to do with education. Communist Cuba, that I just paid a visit to last month, and had a very inspiring, some inspiring days there. We can maybe talk about that later. Was just re-elected to the UN Human Rights Council and also sits on the UN Committee of NGOs. On the basis of these facts, the United Nations Human Rights Council, to be considered as a front-runner in the quest for freedom of speech and human rights around the world, is ludicrous. So what can we do? Well, one way forward, there's also in a way been mentioned by, I think it was Mr. Brown, who said that forward we could entail that only members elected to the Human Rights Council have a proven record of protecting freedom of speech in their respective states. But, and that is of course only a dream, a crazy dream, this is never going to happen in the United Nations as we know it today. So we will have to look in other directions. Where the UN is going depends on the conditions under which concrete criteria are laid down. If we measure it from how enormous the UN has grown, or if you measure the UN on the number of countries that are member states, or the number of subdivisions, and not least the number of employees, it has truly become a great organization. If you measure how many resolutions annually are emitted from the General Assembly and the number of reports produced and how many paper documents are produced, then the United Nations has undoubtedly been an enormous success. But if we should measure the success using the laid down criteria, mostly based on the values of the predominantly Christian countries, the organization has gone rapidly downhill. The free Western-orientated Christian countries are today being pushed and bullied into a vulgar universe in which we, in the Western world, by our own democratic ways, have made ourselves checkmate. We have been bullied by a motley crew of dubious states, Islamic states, insane dictatorships that often try to forward their views and get them qualified and spurred through by communist China, who is in the lead of all this. A China which at the end of the day has its own agenda, which basically means constantly finding new countries to exploit economically and diplomatically. A phenomenon which was formerly known in Europe as Lebensraum. In my eyes, the UN has got so far away from the original ideas that we should tone down, and that's my suggestion, our UN involvement to next to nothing, and instead use our energy and money in the foundations and unity we already have, in, for example, NATO, to create a new association with the purpose of serving the interests of the countries of the free Western Hemisphere. In this new collaboration, I would of course like to see other Western-oriented countries like New Zealand, Australia, Israel, Japan, and of course, if possible, also Russia. A new organization of free Western countries whose most important task will be to serve the Western world, and with diplomatic means, as well as by military means, to stand up against the rising Islamization of the West, as well as standing up against fascism and communism. It is precisely this crucial showdown with the United Nations in which I think a great many leaders of the free world are already gradually accepting the necessity of entering into. Thank you very much.